Do you remember much about the live event itself? It's quite a long time ago, this one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a long time ago, isn't it? Yeah, no, I do, because it wasn't the first live we'd done. I think it might have been the second one. And the first one we'd done was on a site right in the middle of nowhere when no one could find us at all. And Bawsey's pretty remote, but it was very visible from a main road. And I remember in particular, there was the issue about people stopping on the road to sort of watch what we were doing with binoculars, and security having to spend a lot of time sort of managing people who were trying to come and visit the site, because it was going out live 2 or 3 times a day, and people had worked out where it was, and then word spread. I mean, thank goodness it was before the kind of full, social media age. Otherwise, presumably people would have been there at the drop of the hat. But I remember the live being very busy like that, and then always for the lives, so this is constant buzz of, right, okay, we're going now. And usually when the filming, there's lots of retakes and you have time to sort of refine what you're saying. And it was just, right, we're going now, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and go.
I found it there was something about the site that you really felt like you were sat on this, the word archaeologists sometimes use is palimpsest, the visible Norman tower. But there seem to be multiple layers of archaeology and history on this site, as though, why do you think it attracted so much settlement and so many buildings over the years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, those sites, since we made that programme, there's a term used for these sorts of sites now, which are called persistent places. Which obviously alliterates quite nice. It makes them sound like a slightly, troublesome toddler. But this idea that some places persist in use. I mean, I think it was on a low hill. It was kind of had quite a lot of water around it, so it was locally quite prominent. I remember there was a lot of joking about the fact it was on the highest point in Norfolk, which of course in Norfolk isn't very high, but relatively it's a high point. And I think with some of these places, they get established and that folk memory persists of them having a use in one period that then persists into subsequent periods as a memory of a special place. And I do think there's a association with water is often quite a strong one. People like to be able to deposit stuff in water, and that's a recurring theme in lots of different periods.
We'd been to various other sites where you'd got this sort of amazing series of buildings on a hill in the Anglo-Saxon period. Those Anglo-Saxon places seemed to be a whole series of churches. And was that a picture that you expected to find when you knew which site we were going? Was that a likely thing to happen?
You do see it quite often on Anglo-Saxon sites or church sites, that you'll get an Anglo-Saxon church and perhaps even 2 or 3, and they'll be rebuilt and they get sort of larger over time. So you might start off with a timber post-built structure with the posts going into the ground, and of course they rot out quite quickly, and then they get replaced and built slightly larger, and then they build on stone footings, and they start building in stone. And you often get them either nested inside each other like kind of Russian dolls, or each one sort of extends slightly further in one direction as they perhaps build a chancel on the end where the altar is, to what was a single-cell building. So they tend to get longer. And sometimes they do move slightly in one direction, usually to the east, and sometimes it's just that they're getting bigger. But yes, it's what we expected, and we didn't expect to be able to find so much evidence for it, I think.
It was one of those sites where we integrated what we were doing with field walking and metal detecting. And I think it was a very good example how, if you've got a team of metal detectors working alongside you, they can do some really useful stuff. I mean, those 2 Anglo-Saxon coins that came out, they're not common Anglo-Saxon coins like that. And how did you regard that sort of interaction between those, the metal detectorists, the field walkers, and the sort of material that came out?
I think Bawsey really highlighted both the good and the bad about metal detecting, actually, because of course the earliest finds from that site were made by someone who was metal detecting illegally and hadn't recorded them, and was actually convicted of, the criminal offence of metal detecting without permission. But because that did eventually come to attention, there was then some other metal detectorists who were able to go and work on the site who were reporting what they were finding and putting their finds together with what was recovered from the guy who'd actually tried not to record them. It gave us that bigger picture, which alerted us to the fact that there might be a significant site there. So it was an interesting story of both the problem, because if the original illegal metal detecting had never reported anything, we'd never have known about the significance of the site, and so much of our understanding of it, that it was a high status site, that it had evidence of literacy from those styli, those writing tools, that it had the coins, as you say, that it's probably a trading centre of some description, that it's probably a royal site with that much wealth on it. We wouldn't have known any of that if it wasn't for the metal detecting.
Which of those finds, created the greatest impression on you? I mean, we'll get to what we found on day 3, but in terms of the small finds, the coins, the metalwork, the styli, were there some finds that were particularly memorable for you?
I think the find that really stuck in my mind actually was probably the least glamorous of them all, which was the Loom Weight, a clay Loom Weight that we found in the ditch, the enormous ditch that surrounded the church and a whole of that hilltop, really. And we'd seen this ditch on the aerial photographs. It had turned up in places on geophysics, but not terribly clearly. But of course, we had no idea what date it was from the aerial photograph of the geophysics. So we put a trench across it. It's an enormous, great big ditch, and we spent a lot of time, digging through that, hoping to find some dating evidence. And then, fairly close to the bottom, we found this 8th century Loom Weight. And it looks just like a big lump of stone with a hole in it, but it wasn't. It's made of clay and it's datable. And I think that moment when we got that datable evidence from the ditch there and the shape of that Loom Weight, that's the one that really sticks in my mind.
I must admit, it was with some relief, I remember, on that final day when we suddenly began to find the burials. There's a point at which the word ditch becomes, oh, not another ditch, although it's absolutely essential to a site like that to find the boundaries and things. At what point did you get involved in the burial that we found and realize the pathology of it?
Yeah, the discovery of the human remains, the skeletons there, was very interesting because we put that trench in near the church. I think it was on day 2, I can't remember precisely. And we found some sort of burials, slightly disturbed burials, fairly soon, quite shallow in the soil. You often don't get very deep stratigraphy on a rural site. The layers just don't build up, particularly not on the hilltop, where if anything they fall away down the hill from it. We found the burials. And that wasn't a great surprise because we thought they were medieval. We thought they were the same date as the church. You've got a church, you expect to have a churchyard there. Okay, it was outside the current boundary of the churchyard, but that's not hugely unexpected. They're at the west side of the church. So we were sort of working through those. We could see we've got Christian cemetery. And then we found this other burial. And I was actually the other end of the site when the sort of news first came across. And I remember dashing over to have a look and start to sort of really see what was going on and start to examine it. And it was immediately of interest because it was below the other burials. It was also below a feature that we knew was of 10th, 11th century date. It was a strange thing, looked like a poached egg maker, a sort of medieval oven, but that had got a piece of Thetford ware in it. So we knew that must have gone out of use before about 1100 AD, and this skeleton was below it. So that was immediately pushing that back almost certainly into the Anglo-Saxon period. So it was immediately of interest for that reason. And then, of course, the pathology on it was really, really striking. I mean, really staggering.
That was, I think Margaret said that actually you very rarely see such a blindingly obvious event that has created someone's death like that.
That's what was so. I mean, that's the story of this. Is just so you couldn't make it up, really. So immediately, normally with any skeleton that's been buried in a grave, the first thing you find is the skull because it's the big solid bit of the bone. It doesn't collapse flat. So you always find the skull first. And one of the first things we saw with this is that it got an enormous hole in the skull. Now, usually in an archaeological context, that's because someone wasn't expecting it and they put their mattock through it. But this was nothing to do with that at all. This was an injury in antiquity. And it was really striking because there was a whole chunk of the skull at the size of the palm of your hand was completely separated and been put back in position. And that's really uncommon. I remember talking to Margaret about it, and, you know, we were both, this is amazing. We said, oh, Saxon, he's got this massive wound. It's got to be with a bladed implement. It's got to be something sharp enough to take that off. And it looked an immediately fatal injury. It looked completely unsurvivable. But of course, and that's kind of where we stopped at the end of day 3 live filming. And this is another thing about the live filming, is you don't have time to do that sort of post-filming editing and getting your specialist reports back. So we finished at the end of that live day with, hey, we've got an Anglo-Saxon skeleton who died of a violent injury. It's really heavily built skull with heavy brow ridges, looked very male. We thought it was a fighter or perhaps a monk who'd been defending the monastery, had been attacked and then buried in this grave with the other burials around it. And that's how we finished the live. And then, of course, like with any archaeological excavation and all of Time Team's excavations, all of the finds and all of the evidence and all the records we've made all go off for detailed analysis to be written up so that those reports are available for people in the future to understand the past better. And in the process of doing that, we then made kind of these staggering discoveries about this injury and indeed this person and indeed all of the skeletons. So the first thing we discovered was actually the wound, the piece of bone hadn't all been removed in one go. There'd been a sharp bladed injury, and then the rest of the bone had been removed in a surgical procedure. So that told us that person must have survived the injury, almost certainly, because why else would you do the surgical procedure? And then when we looked even more closely, we could see there was some microscopic bone regrowth around the injury site. So that confirmed that person might have survived the injury. In the meantime, the DNA results were coming back from the lab, and those showed that the skeleton was actually female, big, heavily built, solid female, but nonetheless female. And that kind of really changed the perspective, much less likely to be a warrior or anyone defending the site, perhaps a nun, perhaps a villager. They come to the monastery for this medical attempt to save their life. As the examination of the skeleton went on, we discovered there were bite marks from a carnivore on the upper femur, the thigh bone, which again must have happened before the person went into the grave. If they'd had this operation on the head and then been buried, which they didn't survive for more than a few days, and then been buried, there's no opportunity where that body would have been left out for an animal to scavenge it. So we thought initially it might have been maybe the attacker with the sword had had a dog with them or something. But actually the closest match was to a badger. And that's like, how did this person then get to be attacked by a badger? And we infer from that they must have been unconscious at some point after the attack on their own, because of course a badger would have been frightened off if there had been anyone with this person. And they must have been scavenging this injury, probably because there was another injury from a sword on the leg, which the blood had attracted the badger. Badgers are very omnivorous, they'll eat anything. It's probably gone to try and scavenge what it must have thought was a dead thing.
It's amazing the fact that they did try to save this woman. There was a group of people, which Victor showed beautifully in his picture there, and you can see the concern and care that they must have taken. Did you think that implies she was an important person, or was it just, kind of the group of people there had some of those skills and decided to save her or try to save her?
It seems more likely to me that she was quite important. She may have been one of the religious members of the monastic community. You do sometimes get double houses with monks and nuns in them in the Anglo-Saxon period. So she may have been a nun. She was in sort of middle age. I think she was around 40 to 50. The osteology seemed to suggest. And so, and as you say, that effort to just try and save her life. And in that period, sort of surgery wasn't really terribly encouraged. The idea of sort of invading the body was not a routine thing in the way that it is now. So they're almost taking it to the nth degree, to the absolute limit, to try and save this person.
Do we have any idea of who her attacker might have been? Were there Viking attacks during that period on the Norfolk coast, as there were in many places?
Yeah, we know this is, I mean, her radiocarbon dates are very much in that sort of 7th, 8th century period when Viking attacks on, well, Danish and Viking attacks on Eastern England, and indeed right round the UK and right down as far as sort of places like Dublin are increasingly common. And we also know that monastic sites are targeted because at that time in these period of raiding, what the raiders are after really is the loot, as it were, the booty from the monastic sites, because they're where the wealth was held. And of course that ties into all those finds from the metal detecting, where we did find, you know, gold coins, exactly the sort of stuff that the Viking raiding would have been after, and goodness knows what other sorts of valuables as well. When you think of something like the Alfred jewel, that beautiful pointer from Somerset, which is jewel and gold and crystal, you know, these are the sorts of objects. You know, you're not only a sort of century after Sutton Hoo, you know, you've got that sort of tradition of wealth that is by then, you know, at the time of our Bawsey site, being centred on the monastery. So I would think that Viking raiders have got to be the certainly the prime suspect, though it could have been, it's also a period when various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms are warring between each other. But I can't really see an obvious context for an attack on a monastic community that, you know, works within that sort of infighting between Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. So I think it's more like to be a Viking raider. And the other thing is, it's very skilled. There's actually 3 blows to that skull. There's the main one that took off the bone, but there's also 2 others just above the ear, and they're all placed in very closely together. You'd have to be a really skilled swordsman to get those in so close together. Probably the woman was felled by the first blow, and a couple of others were just trying to sort of you know, finish off the job. Wasn't moving at that point, but still it suggests really skilled swordsmanship, and also probably someone on a horse, because they're from above. So you can build up quite a picture of your raider, skilled with a sword, able to wield his sword from horseback effortlessly, accurately, but really just intent on a monastic site of looting it.
It seems to me, are those the kind of sites that you look at and think, my goodness, if that one site had that huge amount of history in it, and that we managed to at least bring some sort of information, it makes them the sort of site, would you want to do a similar site again in the future, preferably with a bit more time?
I think they're some of the most interesting sorts of sites. Those sites are sort of connected to history, but connected to history at a sufficiently hazy period that you really are very dependent on the archaeology. And of course, something like Bawsey had everything. You know, it had the finds, it had the features, it had the human remains, it had the standing building, and it was also accessible. You could spend, you know, you could spend 20 years of your career doing fieldwork on nothing but a site like Bawsey and still have questions to chase up. It would be an amazing place, or a place like that would be an amazing place to, you know, really spend a lot of time on.